I began thinking that we needed to be explicit about what psychoanalytic therapists considered the good life, not just the asymptomatic life. What are the concepts that therapists have in mind about what progress is? I have 10 of these concepts, sort of arbitrarily grouping them into 10. The first one, which is typical for some kinds of therapies too, is safety and a sense of attachment security. If you have an insecure attachment style, a therapist keeps an eye on, can I help you develop more of what Peter Fonagy calls epistemic trust? Can you become safer in relationship? Seeing another human being as a source of comfort and not just torment. There are two conditions under which people will move from less secure attachment styles to more secure attachment styles. One is a devoted relationship that lasts at least 5 years. And the other is intensive psychotherapy for at least 2 years. And I know some other researchers are finding some other therapeutic avenues toward increasing attachment security as well. Self-continuity is a sense of, being essentially the same person going through time and space. We know that all human beings get into different self states, but some people really experience themselves totally differently in one self state or another. Or they don't have continuity through time. You ask them about what kind of kid they were, and they say, I don't know, as if they're thinking about some weird stranger. Or you ask them, how do you see yourself in 5 years? And they go, there's a quality of not being able to have continuity in time that's part of self-constancy. Capacity to see good and bad in the self and not flip from I'm all good to I'm all bad. Same with other people. There's another element of self-constancy, and that's whether you feel continuity with your own body. More and more patients that I see seem to regard their body as a foreign object. You can cut it, you can burn it, you can starve it, as if it's an it. They don't feel fully embodied. They don't feel like their body is me. They don't feel that their body deserves for them to eat well, exercise well. They can abuse their body. So that's part of it too. The other, the non-constant ways of being are various kinds of dissociation from the self. The third one on my list is a sense of agency, or what people from the CBT world call self-efficacy, or the psychoanalytic literature used to call autonomy. But however you describe it, it's the sense that you have some capacity to influence your life. You make choices. Mostly as therapists, we notice this when it's not there. Where we say to a patient, well, why did you marry your wife? And you get an answer like, well, I don't know, it seemed like the thing to do at the time. Or you ask a teenage girl, when you found yourself giving oral sex to that guy, were you feeling desire? Was that what you wanted? And they look at you like you have 3 heads, like it never occurred to them that their sexual activity should be a result of their own desire, So many times people talk as if the world happens to them. And although the world does happen to all of us, even in extreme situations like the concentration camps, people found small ways to feel like they had some degree of freedom, some option, and helping the patient, even in terrible circumstances, to find some element of the possibility of a sense of agency in this situation. I seem to work with a lot of people who don't know how to say what they want or negotiate for what they want, who get into a state of constant resentment because other people should just know what they need and offer what they need. And I say to them, did you consider making your own needs explicit? And I get this, what do you mean needs? as if that's, a source of shame if you have any need for other people. So there are many things that can be in the way of feeling a sense of agency. We hope to help people develop self-esteem that is both realistic and reliable, okay? Realistic self-esteem is, I'm good enough. I don't expect to give an interview and not sometimes mispronounce things. But if I don't do that too often with you, I can leave this interview feeling, okay, that was a decent interview, I'm good enough. I don't, beat myself up that I was supposed to give a perfect interview. So if you're a perfectionist, you have an unreasonable degree of, an unreasonably strict criterion for your self-esteem, and anything short of perfection, you feel lousy. The converse can be a problem too, when you think everything you say is, God's truth revealed, then you're acting as if, everybody else should be bowing down to your brilliance, and that's not realistic either. So that's the realistic part. You want people to evaluate themselves based on reasonably high standards, but standards that are meetable, right? The reliable part is that you can tolerate being criticized without falling completely apart. You can get feedback about how you could have done something better, and it doesn't send you into a depression. And, if people flatter you and suck up to you, you don't feed on that and think, wow, you are the best thing since sliced bread. You can tolerate both sycophancy and criticism and keep some kind of, it might be painful or it might be briefly inflating, but your general sense of who you are and what your values are and whether you're good enough survives those things. A lot of our patients get absolutely flattened by any kind of interruption of their version of self-esteem maintenance. When we figure out, this is my story, this makes sense of who I am, it does contribute to realistic self-esteem, as opposed to, well, I have several talents, but if anybody knew the real me, whatever that is, they'd be disillusioned. Resilience, resilience, flexibility, that kind of thing. Yeah, affect regulation. There's a group of things that involves what Elliot Juris calls affect modulation, the capacity to keep yourself within a tolerable range of overstimulation, understimulation, intensity, non-intensity, to not overreact. And part of this is if you can use more high-functioning defenses, your mature defenses like humor and sublimation. Part of it is just being able to use self-talk. I think the CBT movement is very good at helping people with some of the things you can say to yourself if you're trying to regulate affects that seem to be out of control. Just the, what we used to call ego strength is really in this area. It's, can you go through difficult stuff and still maintain a sense that you're going on being? And we don't understand resilience very well. In other words, we understand why traumatic experience breaks people down. We understand it better than we used to. But we don't know why some kids seem to go through the same thing other kids do, and those kids get stronger. The phrase, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, is probably true, but we don't understand who it kills and who it makes stronger. But psychotherapy should strengthen you over time in the sense of being able to cope with stress without getting primitive, without getting reactive, without feeling like dirt. The capacity to reflect on the self and to mentalize other people is another category. We used to call the capacity to reflect on the self the capacity to see things ego-dystonically or as ego-alien. In other words, I'm I can look at a part of myself that I want to change. I don't feel all bad. I've got some perspective on it. Or psychiatrically, we've called that insight into illness, or we've talked generally about insight. The capacity to look at one's own mind is what Fonagy calls reflective function, so that's the contemporary way of talking about this capacity. And if a patient has this, they're easy to work with. If they don't have it, one of the first orders of business is to help them develop a capacity to look at themselves. Why do you think you got triggered there? Or what's the pattern of when you find yourself feeling paranoid? Or when did you find yourself immediately going to that explanation? So we try to cultivate that. The old psychoanalysts used to try to believe that insight was the cause of therapeutic change. And sometimes it is. Sometimes people get an insight that really allows them to move forward. But more often, it's a result of therapeutic change. You start changing and then you get insight into how you were before, and what happened to you, because now you can experience things differently. And the flip side of that is the capacity to imagine the subjective experience of other people. So you can look at your own mind, you can imagine other different minds. That's what Buber called an I-thou relationship, when you can see the other person as a subject, not just an object. And we try to help patients toward that. We try to do it in the therapy relationship. Can you imagine I might have had a motive other than to hurt you when I said such and so to you? The capacity to be self-advocating and also sacrifice for the larger community. I was very interested in Sidney Blatt's work that found that there's this dimension that runs all through clinical writing about needs for individual self-advocacy and needs to adapt to the community. Different cultures, when they raise kids, put the emphasis on different parts of that. In Western cultures, we tell people this crazy story: you can be anything you put your mind to being. This is nonsense, of course. You can't be a giraffe, at least yet. But, we emphasize the side of self-advocacy, self-definition, right? In Eastern cultures, in indigenous and tribal cultures, they usually put the emphasis on finding a way to be useful to the community. And we need both. The sins of over-individual, aggressive self-advocacy are probably greater than the sins of putting the good of the whole ahead of the good of the self. But what's interesting about Blatt's work is when I first read it, I was thinking about this dimension, agency, community. It's even kind of in the introversion, extroversion idea. It's a theme that runs all the way through psychoanalytic writing. Balance, work on the octanophil versus the philobat. That there's some people that, when they're upset, they move toward other people, and other people want to be alone and have a lot of space. So we all have some tension between those two poles. When I first read his work, I thought, well, then mental health would adhere in being somewhere in the middle. And probably be influenced by your culture and what's adaptive to your culture. But his work actually showed that in people who test psychological health as psychologically healthy on a number of dimensions, they're strong on both ends. They're not in the middle. They can advocate for themselves when that's appropriate, and they can subordinate their own needs to the needs of the community or another person or their child when that's required. So that's an interesting dimension to keep in mind for therapists. One of the reasons I put that on my list of 10 is that Western therapists often pathologize cultures that put the emphasis on the other end. For example, I had an Indian student who was describing the tendency in Indian families to live with your family until you're married. And people were saying, oh, the whole culture supports borderline psychology because they're not promoting separation, individuation. Well, it's not pathological at all. It's a different way of, defining development. We're getting up to what, vitality? I wanted to put an emphasis on that because when I think about the patients that I have the hardest time helping, it's the patients who are kind of dead inside. I work hard to find something that enlivens them. It's not exactly depression. It's a kind of anhedonia that can be characteristic of anybody. It's like, prove to me that there's any point in living life. I find those people really hard to help. It's as if they engage with therapy like, yeah, okay, see if you can enliven me, nobody else can. And often when you hear their histories, you hear that, their natural enthusiasm, curiosity, energy got squelched in ways very early that it's hard for them to recover from. It's hard to get a relationship going with them that matters to them because they're in this defensive place of nothing matters to me. And the deadness that can come into the therapy room, it's harder for me to bear than, when patients come in and they're furious at me and they're in paranoid rage, they're at least alive and we're engaged and we're trying to work something out. But if the patient kind of goes, yeah, see if you can bring me to life, nobody else can, it's really hard. But vitality, there isn't as much theorizing about vitality. Okay, acceptance of things that can't be changed. Again, researchers like to organize how they evaluate a therapy based on what progress you make, what you've accomplished, what symptoms you've reduced. But psychotherapy isn't entirely about changing things. A lot of it is about coming to an acceptance of things that can't be changed. You can't change the fact that you were traumatized at age 3. And a lot of psychotherapy is helping people come to accept who they are, not just to change who they are.
Did this come from positive psychology, or is this?
No, actually, I have some quibbles with positive psychology. For example, they put a lot of emphasis on happiness. Right. But from a psychotherapist's point of view, it's not all about trying to be happy. It includes trying to tolerate natural states of grief and other negative affect. You can get, sometimes in the course of changing for the good, you can get temporarily more symptomatic. Like if you're trying to change a habitual behavior towards something that feels riskier but is healthier, you're going to get more anxious for a while. If you have been handling a terrible grief with denial, and you start realizing how sad you are and going through the mourning process in therapy, you'll probably test low, more depressed on a Beck depression inventory, but the treatment's moving forward. It opens the door to gratitude for what is. If you accept the stuff that you can't change and you grieve it, you can move on to both forgiveness and gratitude. So a lot of people think that psychoanalytic therapy is all about parent blaming. And sometimes patients go through a phase of blaming parents, but in a good therapy, you should eventually emerge with a deep compassion for the fact that your parents were who they were. Given their history, they didn't have the option to be otherwise. That's what was the hand that you were dealt. You accept that, you forgive them, you're grateful for the good stuff, and it enriches life greatly to be able to grieve and feel gratitude for what is. I've always been struck by the fact that I've known several people who got a terminal cancer illness, and suddenly, when they really accept the diagnosis, they go, I'm going to enjoy every sandwich. There's something about acknowledging mortality that makes life much more precious, So that's acceptance. The 10th thing is a hodgepodge. It's really what I think of as the combination of all the other things: love, work, and play. And Freud was asked, what he defined as cure, or what did a non-neurotic person look like? And he said, someone who can love and work. And Erickson quoted him as saying that. It's not in his written writing. But Richard Sturba also asked him that, and in that conversation he said, and enjoyment, of course, and play. So I think he was righter with Sturba, that to have a good life, you need to be able to love. And I think when Freud said that, he didn't mean it had to be heterosexual love with, a monogamous marriage and 2.5 kids and a white picket fence. He meant, can you love people as they are, rather than idealizing them and making them up? Can you be devoted to their welfare? Can you make sacrifices on behalf of them? Do they exist as a subject to you, not just an object? That's love. Some people don't have that capacity. Work, I don't think he meant holding down a job. He meant doing something that has a meaning for you. It may have meaning that it's putting food on the table for your family. It may be drudgery, but it has that meaning. It may be, you may be lucky enough to be in a profession where you love your work, in which case it's inherently satisfying. But a lot of the psychopathology that I think we're seeing among young people these days is they don't feel they have meaningful work. Yeah, they can get a job, flipping pancakes, but, and yeah, they can distract themselves with 1 million video games, but they're not important in their communities as contributors to the communities. They don't feel like adults yet. They don't feel like they're acknowledged as contributors. And the dignity of all kinds of work should be, I matter, no matter what your work is, it should be something that you feel has a meaning. And play, we now know that all mammals play. I don't know the neurology of this, but Panksepp told me that it strengthens areas in the brain to do this rough and tumble, unscripted, naturalistic play. It helps you learn to focus and concentrate. And he wondered whether the increase in ADD and ADHD had to do with the fact that our young kids aren't out there in the backyard, or on the urban streets mixing it up with each other. They're getting supervised this and supervised that and being stuck in front of screens. And so their brain isn't getting that stimulation for some reason. But all known cultures get involved in some kind of play. They sing together, they dance together, they have athletic events together. In our culture, it's so massive that we tend to go to concerts and go to dance performance and watch athletic activity. And I don't know whether that does different things to the brain than being a participant in a smaller community. But we need to make space in our life for that kind of play. And patients who can't play are kind of dreary characters. So if you can't love or you can't find any meaning in work and you can't play, you're in trouble, no matter what your symptoms are. That's true. I do think that psychoanalysis is another wisdom tradition.
Woo!
It's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Okay.
Great job. You did it. I'm so grateful.
Oh, you're very welcome.